It's finally here, the transatlantic Panther, my 2004 Mercury Grand Marquis that I bought and drove around in Florida and shipped and imported over here to the Netherlands is finally here. A big old American sedan, full-size, body-on frame, V8 engine, rear-wheel drive. This is really the last of its kind. They're never going to make a car like this again, and this is the last of its kind in the modern era. These don't really exist in Europe, so I really wanted to ship one over because I think they're quite rare over here and they really stand out on these Dutch streets. But also I wanted to understand, what is the process, what does it cost, how long does it take? So I'm going to cover all of that in this video. It's been many months in the making. I picked this up in Florida in March and drove it around there when I was visiting and then shipped it over shortly thereafter. It is now beginning of August and I finally have the car. So I'm going to cover all of that in detail in this video. It's going to be a lengthy video, so be sure to use the chapter markers so you can skip around to see, the part that you're interested in. But for now, let's jump into it. It's like sitting in a living room couch. So first off, a few disclaimers. There's a lot of variables that can go into shipping and importing a car into the Netherlands or any other country. So as the saying goes, your mileage may vary. That's an important caveat here. I learned the hard way maybe that there's a lot more costs and time involved, especially if it's an uncommon car that's not imported all of the time to Europe. The other thing to note is that I worked with a company called SCL Rotterdam. They're no way sponsoring this video or helped at all with the costs, but they were a really great company to work with because their website was very clear in terms of the process and what to expect. They were very friendly, very helpful staff. All spoke great English. They had an on-site garage to make any sort of adjustments or repairs. They're really kind of a one-stop shop, and that's what really appealed to me about going through this process, is I felt like I was, taken care of. I had seen SCL Rotterdam license plate frames around Amsterdam for a lot of expats who've moved and relocated with their car, so that's why I checked out the website and used them. But they're in no way sponsoring this video or helping out, so just keep that in mind when you hear SCL Rotterdam. So the first thing is, if you're thinking about importing an American car to the Netherlands, you have to go and buy a car. I'm not going to cover that process here. There's a lot of factors and a lot of things that vary with that. And I've covered that a little bit about this car in a previous video, so go check that out. I'll link to it in the description below. But the first thing is, of course, acquiring the car and then obtaining a quote from the shipping company of your choice. In this case, as I mentioned, I use SCL Rotterdam. I told them the type of car that I was getting and that I wanted to ship and import, and they gave me a breakdown of all of the different costs in the process as part of the quote. Now, there are a lot of things that can change when it comes to actual costs after you go through the shipping process, so keep that in mind. Keep a buffer. Whatever quote you get, assume extra because it's going to be more expensive most likely, especially if you're importing a rare or uncommon car to the Netherlands that isn't commonly imported over to Europe. The first thing I want to cover is the timeline. Now, what I'll say in a nutshell is the timeline took a lot longer than I expected due to many different factors. One, this isn't a commonly imported car to Europe, so there's a different registration process for that. On top of that, there were some mechanical adjustments that had to be made. But in a nutshell, you can see the timeline here up on the screen. Basically, it left Florida on March 17th, arrived at the port at the beginning of April, had to go through some processes there, and then it arrived to Rotterdam at the end of April. I went and visited the car at the end of April when it arrived at the SCL Rotterdam facility, but that's when the process started, which required inspection, mechanical adjustments, and then the registration process. Now, because this isn't a commonly imported car, there were requirements to go through Germany for some certification letters that makes the Netherlands RDW process a little bit easier. That took a lot longer than I expected and a lot longer than it takes for a normal car because this is an uncommonly imported car. On top of that, there were some mechanical fixes that I had to do. That didn't take too long, but that was also part of the timeline as well. And some of these things happened in parallel. But you can see the general timeline here. Basically, the car left Florida in March, arrived in the Netherlands at the end of April, but then I didn't pick it up until almost the end of July. So it took a lot longer than I expected. The next thing I want to cover is the costs, and this is where it gets interesting. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to cover the purchase process, purchase price. That's all something that's separate. But when it comes to the actual shipping and import costs, especially for an uncommonly imported car like this and an older car like this, there's a lot of costs that go into it. So you can see the details here on the screen, but basically it is, of course, the purchase price of the car. That's something you have to factor in. But then there's transportation costs, depending on where you're picking it up from in the US, getting it to a port, and then shipping it across the ocean over to the Netherlands, and then of course trucking it once it lands to the Netherlands over to the facility in which all of the inspections and things like that are going to take place. In my case, this had to go from Savannah, Georgia, and actually economy container shipping was the most feasible. So it was actually a shared container. Usually I was expecting like roll on or roll off, which is quite common for shipping vehicles across the ocean, but this went by a economy shared container. So after your transport costs, then you have to think about all of the import duties and taxes. Here in the Netherlands, they love taxes, so there are different import duties applied to different costs, as well as overall VAT or value added tax onto the purchase price and other costs as well. So that's another cost you have to keep in mind. In addition to that, you have the overall European inspection and adjustments for the Netherlands and the European market. There are things like side markers which have to be installed, rear fog light has to be installed, and some other adjustments. In the case of the Netherlands, you don't have to put amber turn signals. Many other European countries require that, so I was able to keep the red turn signals that this has. And then another thing that's listed here is BPM. Now BPM has a very complicated calculation. I'm not going to go into that in detail here, but BPM is the tax based on the CO2 emissions of a car. And once a car reaches 18 years old, as this one is, the BPM tax effectively becomes €0, which is great because this is a big 4.6 liter V8 with a lot of emissions. But up until that time when it becomes 18 years old, there is a BPM tax that has to be applied. And so when you import a vehicle, there's a calculation that's done for the BPM tax that you then have to pay as well. So basically you have the purchase price, the shipping costs, the duties and taxes, and then of course any sort of adjustments and registration costs associated with importing the car. You can see here's where they put the rear fog light. They removed one of the reverse lights and replaced it with the rear fog light. And you can see here is the red turn signal that's allowed. That's commonly used in the US and Canada. I didn't have to put an amber turn signal for the Netherlands. The Netherlands allows it. So that was a good cost saving as well. I'm going to do a separate video on all of the differences between US spec vehicles and European spec vehicles, including the turn signal color. Be sure you're subscribed to see that in the future. Okay, so what did it actually cost me to import and register this vehicle over here in the Netherlands? Well, you can see it here on the screen. Here's an overview of all of the actual costs for me. As I mentioned, I didn't have to pay BPM, so that was a nice savings, but what I didn't expect were some of the requirements to adjust certain things for passing the APK or the Netherlands annual inspection for vehicle. It's quite strict, and I might do a separate video on this in the future, but there were a lot of things that had to be adjusted, including the lights, the brakes, the steering box, because the steering had too much play in it. So those were a lot of unexpected costs that I had to face once I went through the process. Like I mentioned, the red turn signals were allowed, so that wasn't an adjustment that had to be made, but of course side markers had to be installed, and then the rear fog light, that wasn't too expensive, but then there were the repairs for that inspection process and to pass that inspection that really added up. That was something I didn't expect, and something to keep in mind if you're importing an older car and planning to register it here in the Netherlands or Germany or anywhere else where that has strict inspections. Those adjustments would be required because even though this was a mechanically good car in the US, it didn't pass the inspections here. So of course it was not cheap, but this is one of the only cars like this on this continent, and that's really cool to me. And the fact that I've driven this car in Florida around in its natural habitat and now imported it to a completely different country, different continent, and it's one of the few cars like this on the road. I get a lot of looks as I'm driving it around. That's really cool to me, and that's really special, and that's something really unique about driving this car around here. So what's it like to drive a big American car on small European streets? Actually, not too bad. Easier than I thought it would be. The front is fine. It actually, you can see everything. Because it's body on frame, you sit a little bit higher, so you can see everything in the front, no problem. It's not too wide. It's about the width of a BMW 7 Series, so it's not like it's excessively wide. The hardest part is the rear. Obviously, it has a big rear, big trunk, and this has no camera, no parking sensors, so it's very much a guessing game, and that's a bit difficult to figure out, but I haven't parked it in too many tight situations where where that's been a problem. So yeah, it's overall not too bad actually. I've even driven it through the city center of Amsterdam, no problem there. Let me know if you want me to do a more detailed video on driving this thing around Amsterdam and the Netherlands in general. Let me know in the comments below. I might make one, but yeah, other than that, it's just like driving an 18-year-old big American car. The roads are quite good though, and it's pretty smooth and it's comfortable, just as it was in Florida. And the fuel here is actually probably the best fuel this car has ever seen. Some people think it needs 98. Euro 95 is plenty good for this car. It's much better quality fuel than we had in the US, so this thing is happy. So that's pretty much it. I'm super ecstatic to have this rare car on this side of the ocean in the European continent, where this car was never really sold, and it's quite a unicorn. It stands out, it's big, it's loud, and honestly there's something cool about that. And I have a few more video ideas lined up, so be sure you're subscribed. But in the meantime, let me know in the comments below what you think. What do you think about the Panther platform cars? What do you think about importing a car? Do you have any questions? Let me know in the comments below. I'll try to answer those. And if you know anyone who's looking for more information, be sure to share this video. And if you have any other questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. And until the next time, thanks for watching. $143. That's less than I thought.
Yeah, this is less. See, they are economical cars.
Depends on how you drive it.